Hello, this is Martin Garkson. I'm a communication studies professor here at Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. This is going to be a short video working through some slides from a presentation I gave at the International City County Managers Association in the fall of 2022. The workshop overall was about deliberative engagement and wicked problems in social psychology, and how to elevate the kind of conversations we need to have in our communities to address our shared problems more productively. But with this presentation is going to focus just on kind of the role of discussion guides, backgrounders, deliberative frameworks, in a sense, to help spark those kind of conversations. So one of the slides that I kind of cover in the workshop is overall these components of deliberative engagement, the things that we do to spark a very different kind of meeting. So we're going to be focusing on that second bullet point here of the development and the use and the theory behind discussion guides and backgrounders. Right? So one quick overview to the work that we do. We use Sam Kaner's work in one way to think about the kind of conversations we need to spark. The first step is divergent thinking is gathering lots of opinions, right? Getting beyond the usual suspects, making sure that all voices are represented and heard in their community. You can do that in lots of different ways, traditional, conventional public engagement processes like surveys or one at a time on the microphone, or emails that are sent to city leadership, or social media comments on newspaper articles, right? There's lots of ways of kind of gathering that. Actually, one of our concerns is too much of our public engagement is simply input, is simply gathering opinions. And deliberative engagement or thick engagement is about taking all those kind of opinions and actually having people engage each other, interact each other, develop mutual understanding, dig into some of the inherent trade-offs and tensions that are part of all tough issues. That's the Wicked Problems framework. So these discussion guides that we're talking about are really about this transition from that first stage to the second stage of reporting out what we heard from making sense of the noise and providing a document that helps people work through the groan zone productively, right? That hard work of really understanding each other's opinions, recognizing the wickedness of problems. And then obviously that leads to convergent thinking of how do we actually prioritize, how do we move to action, how do we make some tough decisions about these issues, right? So overall, these, I'm going to go ahead and populate that. These are some of the key kind of underlining theory of these deliberative discussion guides. And this is kind of one of those key tools. The broader workshop gets into the social psychology. I'll post an article that I've written called Process Matters that kind of summarizes this in the Q&A. That deliberative discussion, deliberative processes are trying to avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into the best. And as I learned more and more about social psychology and brain science, the more I realized why discussion guides work so well, why these things that we've been developing and working with for years. So here are some of the key kind of underlying theoretical points, right? First, it honors kind of democratic values by providing a range of perspectives, right? You're not limited to just who shows up at the meeting and then who's comfortable speaking at the meeting. You're able to, in multiple other ways, collect a lot of opinions. You're able to kind of fact check those in some senses, and then create a document that ideally or seeks to represent the full kind of complexity and nuance of the issue and all the voices kind of in your community. So that's changing the conversation already. One time the microphone, people are just walking up and sharing their individual opinion. In a deliberative process, they're often reacting to a document, and that high quality document can really spark much better conversation. Second aspect is key to psychology, that it gives participants a common task to complete. We are groupish. We like to be in teams. Our brains are kind of wired that way. So what we're trying to do is, instead of activate the us versus them kind of teams that might come into a controversial issue in these small groups, the task that we give them is help us refine this document, help us improve this document. We always kind of talk about the documents that they're incomplete, they're not perfect, right? That try to kind of capture the complexity of this issue and the diversity of perspectives in our community and report this out. This is what we heard. But the heart of the process we're asking people to do is to improve that. Tell us what you like here. Tell us what you don't like here. Tell us what's wrong here. If we have something factually wrong that you believe, tell us what's missing and needs to be added. And that whole aspect really kind of changes what's happening. If you don't have that, if someone expresses opinion and someone else disagrees, they have to confront that person. Most people are conflict avoidant, right? Or or it escalates the conflict and kind of turns into something much more negative and defensive. Well, here, if someone has just different opinions about what they like most in the document, that's an easier conversation, right? Particularly with a facilitator, another key component of deliberative engagement. They're trained on how to use this discussion guide and spark much better conversation. So it allows us to get into the groan zone and make our way through the groan zone much more kind of efficiently. Right? Spark creativity connected to a broad range of actors, inherently with a discussion guide. Yes, government is a key tool, a lot of the work that we do, but we also recognize that government is one tool among many. So a discussion guide can be infused with a broad range of actors and perspectives and thinking about who can be part of taking on this issue. So you can engage that and that it broadens the conversation. People typically have kind of wishful thinking. They have that simple kind of magic bullets, or they have devil figures that are cause of things. Discussion guide can really lay out things much differently. And then lastly, is this idea that just the process of creating a discussion guide can be a very useful activity for a community. You can kind of create a drafting team or a steering team that's working on that's representative. You can have some initial meetings just to kind of collect the concerns and the ideas and the potential actors, and that whole process, culminating in a discussion guide in itself is very valuable. Then obviously, once you have that guide, you can use that for additional conversations. So there's lots of benefits to the entire process of developing a quality discussion guide. So what we're going to do here, the rest of this session is give 3 examples of types of discussion guides that, in particular, the Center for Public Deliberation kind of relies on. If you've been to one of my workshops, we start with examples of wicked problem slides. I'll go a little bit quicker here, but the overall idea of a wicked problem slide is, as you're making sense of noise, identifying all the key underlining values to an issue and just kind of putting them explicitly on the table, right? And as you'll see later, this is important because values often aren't explicit, right? Values are these underlining kind of beliefs that fuel people's positions, that fuel their arguments, that fuel their concerns or their complaints or their outrage. But when you identify all those and put them on the table, you help people see the inherent wickedness of problems. You can see that reasonable people will disagree, because part of this, framing the values in a wicked problem slide is you're framing them positively, right? And that helps people get away from our preference to define things as, I'm for good things, and anyone who disagrees with me, we like to define them by what they're against. Now what fuels a lot of kind of the exaggerated polarization. So framing things as positive values help. In the broader workshop, I talk about the 3 conversations that we're trying to have instead of just one value at a time that undermines conversations. How do we have a long-term balancing conversation? How might we have in the short term maybe a recalibration, a shifting of the prioritization of values, which ones are most important or least important, or then ideally this transcending of finding kind of win-wins, ways to use creativity to transcend a conflict, have a better conversation. Here's another one that we actually use for a specific process, identified these values through a survey process, and then brought people together and said, hey, let's talk about these. Which of these are most important to you? Listen to other people as they talk about which ones are important to them. And then how might we work together to, again, find the right balance or transcend the tensions between some of these. This one's a little bit different because, as we reacted to COVID, public health had to be a priority. So we centered that, made it a larger font, but we also wanted to recognize these other values that are expressed in those discussions are relevant. Reasonable people can also have those values. We shouldn't ridicule those. That's what undermined and polarized the conversation, right? So a little bit of a different style of wicked problem slide, which is relevant in some cases when you're wanting to prioritize one thing, but also recognize the other values that might not always fit that, right? And this is another one that I worked with city managers, thinking about all the values underlining what we're trying to do in a city. This is a particular part, some work that I'm doing of how do we think about equity in context, right? And how do we certainly kind of respect the increasing wanting to prioritize equity, but the danger if we look at equity individually, right? That we need to look at equity within a broader range of values and explore some of those tensions if we're going to have the kind of conversation we need to have, right? So wicked problems, some of the basics kind of theory behind it, right? Again, it brings out those underlining values. It helps people understand the wickedness of most difficult issues, and that reasonable people can have different perspectives. So that sparks a much more collaborative conversation versus an adversarial, like other frameworks that's developed through listening to people. The point about that values aren't, again, explicit. There is an art to that. Maybe I'll do a separate video on that at some point, of how do you kind of bring out the underlining values and kind of capture those things. And the last thing, just to kind of reiterate the point, when you look at some of these slides, we're not saying all values are perfectly equal, right? We're saying all values were reasonable, and reasonable people can hold those values. But certainly part of the conversation is recognizing the need to prioritize these things, and particularly recognizing when they're in a competition, that we need to kind of explore that and think about how we best manage those kind of conflicts. Last couple points here about wicked problem slides. It really kind of builds up Fisher and Urey's kind of one of the most famous conflict resolution kind of books. Great book that if you haven't got it yet, one of their chapters talks about the need in negotiation and move from positions to interests. Positions being what people want, interests is why they want it. There's always much more room to work with when you get to the interest level versus a position level, which is often a little bit more zero sum. So that's what wicked problem slides help us do. It helps people feel heard. They see their value on there expressed positively, particularly those that are often kind of more pushed back on and tend to become problematic because they get louder and louder because they feel that it haven't been heard. So when you bring out the underlining positive value of their concern, it helps them feel heard, and it helps them become a more productive part of the conversation, right? So you see the last point where I talked about in terms of shifting that conversation to balancing, prioritizing, and transcending, right? Second aspect is National Issues Forum frameworks. So NIFI, National Issues Forum Institute, so NIFI.com, has been around now 40, 50 years or so, developing discussion guides on national issues. So we use some of their guides, certainly for our training, sometimes in the community. They're creating 2 or 3 of these guides kind of every year. But then we also develop our own guides within this. And this, by the way, is I've got a couple of classes that the assignment for the class, that the semester assignment, is to create an NIF style guide. It's a great assignment for high school kids, for universities, to really engage an issue, but instead of picking side on an issue and giving a speech or writing a paper on an individual perspective, doing the work of recognizing the wickedness and laying out the options people have and the consequences of those actions and where the data lies, and supporting various approaches, right? So a basic feature of NIS Forum is, it's framed in some sense of, hey, what should we being the broad community, so it starts from a broad kind of aspect, do about X? Where X is kind of a problem, and that most people agree is a problem. They might disagree on why it's a problem. Certain disagree on what we should do about a problem, but you're at least starting with common ground, right? And the first few pages of an NIF guide often kind of establish the problem, with statistics, with facts of why status quo is problematic. We need to do something, right? And in particular, it's important with these discussion guides to try to engage the public at the stage that they recognize a problem, but they haven't latched onto a particular solution yet, right? They're open-minded. So we tap into the positive creativity of the human brain to work the problem, instead of the problematic, like, once I've made a decision, my brain wants to defend that decision. If you're engaging people on a yes-no issue to a policy, everyone walking in has already said, made up their mind yes or no. So they're not thinking. They're not there to work. You're not getting the best of human nature. So the NIF discussion guides help back up the conversation. Let's start again from the what should we do? Let's get that as the primary identity, that we're coming in as problem solvers rather than coming in as advocates of a particular solution, and see what kind of conversation that sparks, right? So each of these NIF frameworks have a broad question and then 3 or 4 approaches on how to kind of take on that question. Each approach has a set of actions. Each approach inherently kind of prioritizes certain values and probably does not so well on other values. And each approach has trade-offs, right? There's a recognition that there is no magic bullet. There's no right way to do things, right? So these approaches it's not the idea that you have an NIF forum and then you vote at the end, hey, which approach should we do? You're not picking one approach. Any community is likely to draw actions and ideas from all 4 approaches. The framing, the purpose of an NIF framework is more to ensure a full conversation, to get past the individual kind of solutions, the one at a time on the microphone, to get past the magic bullet or the devil figure kind of wishful thinking kind of blame, and actually kind of dig into the issue. Yeah, so you see, the recognition, you can have it kind of inherently in there. That there's going to be things people like on each approach, but there's also there's cost to each approach, there's trade-offs to each approach. So it helps you, the framework, there's clear tensions to explore as you're going through the grown zone between the approaches, but there's also tensions within the approaches, right? Because you can't have more of what you want sometimes without also getting more of something you don't want or giving up something that you want to keep, right? So this is kind of one way it looks like, right? Overall issue, you have different approaches. Those approaches are kind of have a collection of actions that kind of connect to them. And then there's things that people really like about those actions and their concerns. And those concerns, this is the wicked problem slide on the bottom, right? These are all the different values people care about those issues. Those values fit the approaches in various different ways, right? So here are a few just different examples. I'll post a link, nifi.org. Has lots of different examples to this, but you'll also have a link to workshop folders from the CPD that have examples of some ones that we've developed. Some of these, the NIF guides, sometimes are 25, 30 pages. But then the last couple pages are always like a quick summary of the approaches. When we run events, we often just copy those last 2 pages and we call it a placemat because it's kind of waiting for them at the table. And that's primarily what I use. So the broader discussion guide can be helpful for to the facilitators, to other things of listening to the details. But you can normally summarize these NIF things just on, 3 or 4 pages, or often a 11 by 17 kind of tabloid page can kind of capture it. And sometimes we just develop that 1-pager. We don't have the time to develop the full discussion guide. But this is one that was developed. I was not involved in this one. This was before I was here in Colorado, with the city of Longmont kind of south of us. So kind of a future planning kind of thing that creates these 4 approaches. And then again, there's several pages on each approach with actions and trade-offs and so forth. This is one that we did create that you'll have access to in the folder of looking at rethinking transportation as people age. So you have 4 approaches here. You'll notice on this one, if you want to pause and look at the details, that each approach kind of focuses on a different actor, right? What is their role in really making sure that seniors have the transportation and the connection that they need as they grow older. This is an example of one of those 1-page 11 by 17. So again, you can pause here if you want to look at more the specifics of this. But this is a process that the CPD ran in Routt County about local food. So again, 3 approaches, initial kind of short summary of that approach, some specific kind of action items, some broad arguments of why people support this approach, and then a recognition of the trade-offs of the problems. So again, you see the tensions between the approaches and tensions within the approaches. So overall, National Issues Forum particularly work well with human nature. Our brains are wired to focus on the upside of our position and the downside of the opposing position. So a nice National Issues Forum helps people see the things that they often don't see, which is the inherent downside of their position and the upside of opposing positions. And it does it in a way that just kind of helps the brain kind of process it in a sense, right? Works against the wishful thinking, like I mentioned, by being explicit about the trade-offs and working through that, you avoid kind of that dominant thing of having simple solutions to complex problems. Facilitates that working through the grown zone. You're building on the common ground. You're framing people from the beginning as working together on this problem. What should we do about X? But also recognizing the complexity of lots of different ways of doing that. Brings in good data as you're developing these from listening to the public voice in terms of their concerns and their ideas and so forth. But then also, as you create the guide, you're infusing it with good information, right? So you can have some kind of key facts in those guides. If there's ideas that are problematic, right, you can kind of filter those out. So then this discussion guide really helps you have a much more productive conversation, right? You see on the bottom the point I made about what should we do, and have that broad notion of who we are, right? The next one is Viewpoint Documents, and we developed a few different of these examples that you'll be able to kind of see. But overall, I've used Viewpoint Documents earlier in the conversation. So like really once we starting to get a sense of the different perspectives and we want to spark a conversation and kind of refine that and kind of clarify that. And when there's not like, when 3 or 4 approaches is a little bit too narrow. So often Viewpoint Documents have, 8 or 10 kind of approaches. We still try to kind of narrow it to 1 page because we want something people showing up to an event or jumping on Zoom, being able to kind of process that pretty quickly. So expands beyond that, pretty short documents that just try to capture multiple perspectives on an issue, very much framed as reasonable people can have these perspectives, right? So you're making sense of the noise, but then you're choosing language, you're creating a document again designed to spark discussion. So it allows people to kind of, in a more productive way, see the broad range of perspectives from their communities and hopefully think about it in a little bit of a different way, right? So the heart of the wicked problems are the questions. I mean, the viewpoints documents are the questions. So we ask these 4 questions, again, with that idea of giving them a common task to do. Right. So which of these viewpoints matches your own, which raises concerns, which you want to push back on, which has you thinking differently, a question I love, right? Because that allows people to push back on their natural kind of preference for certainty, right? So they can say, yeah, I haven't thought about it this way. They can kind of admit that intellectual humility, which is so critical for us to work on our shared problems. And then always, what viewpoints are missing, what's not on there that you think should be on there, right? So here's kind of one example. This one had like 8 or 9 just on the screen to make it big enough. I just kind of give you the first 3, and I'll put a link to this. But this is a process that we ran for the city on the role of data, right? So the idea of our ability to collect data and share data has just exploded exponentially in the last couple of decades. Our ability to make sense of data and turn data into usable knowledge and into better decisions has lagged, right? So we did a process and lots of different perspectives on data, right? Some people love data. Some people, we have to have good metrics on everything. And then others express a few concerns. These first ones are kind of the more positive, and then we get to the more concerns in there. Again, you can look at the full document in the Q&A. But this is the overall. It was a 1-pager. Right, explains the document a little bit at the top, has the 4 questions, and then had about 8 or 9 different kind of viewpoints. We asked people to read through them all first, and then in the process, they just kind of walk through answering those questions, and which effectively gets them in the groan zone and helps them start work through the groan zone, right? This is not a document designed to convergent thinking, to move to decisions. This is more to report out from the divergent thinking and start the process of really getting to the groan zone, developing kind of more mutual understanding as we go through, right? So that's it. That's just 3 of the different kind of frameworks. There are other frameworks out there. Everyday Democracy has some great ones for some longer processes. We do some that are just basically argument maps that we just kind of report out. Hey, here are the key arguments on each side in a 1-page thing. So there's other different models. But those are 3 of the key models that we use at the CBD just to kind of give you a sense of these discussion guides and the value of them as key components to deliberative engagement. Thank you.